Could these 10 states leave the USA? Predictions: shocking possibilities. The idea of a US state breaking away from the Union might sound like something out of a political thriller or a sci-fi novel, but history tells a different story. With growing divides in politics, economics, and culture, the whispers of secession are no longer just background noise. In fact, some states are seeing real movements gain traction, capturing the attention of millions. Today on the Journey of Wisdom, we'll dive into 10 US states where the possibility of secession isn't just a wild theory, it's a topic of serious debate. Some of these states have historical roots in independence, while others are fueled by modern-day frustrations, from tax battles and federal mistrust to cultural clashes and calls for local control. Could the map of America look different in the future? And what would that mean for all of us? Before we begin this eye-opening journey, don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new perspective on the world around us. Number 10. California. Often referred to as the Golden State, has long been more than just another part of America. With a staggering gross domestic product projected to exceed $4 trillion by the year 2025, California alone ranks as the 5th largest economy in the world, surpassing even some major nations. In both spirit and structure, it already operates like a country within a country. Advocates of the Calexit movement argue that California's progressive values often clash with those of the federal government, especially on sensitive issues like immigration, climate change, and environmental policy. As divisions in the United States deepen, many Californians feel the weight of being misunderstood, even shackled, by a system that does not reflect their vision for the future. Recent data supports this growing sentiment. A Public Policy Institute of California poll conducted in the year 2024 showed that 32% of Californians favor secession, up from 25% just a decade ago. This is no longer just a fringe idea. It is a reflection of a widening gap in identity, ideology, and aspiration. Supporters of independence believe that California's unmatched strength in technology, innovation, agriculture, and entertainment gives it every tool to not only survive, but thrive on its own. Silicon Valley, Hollywood, the Central Valley's farmlands. Each is a powerhouse in its own right, and yet no dream comes without its shadows. Critics are quick to highlight the state's heavy reliance on imported water, a housing crisis that continues to spiral, and an ever-present threat from wildfires worsened by extreme climate conditions. These vulnerabilities raise important questions. Could an independent California navigate these storms alone? Or would it become overwhelmed without the safety net of federal aid and nationwide? Economists caution that secession could fracture vital trade relationships and cut off funding for healthcare, infrastructure, and social services that millions of people depend on. And underneath all of this, a deep cultural divide continues to grow, not just between California and more conservative states, but within the state itself, between urban progressives and rural communities. But maybe, in this conversation, we find something more than just politics or economics. We uncover a timeless lesson about identity, autonomy, and interdependence. In the modern context, this could mean that while independence may look like freedom on the surface, true peace often comes from cooperation, understanding, and shared values. Life today is full of pressures. The pressure to succeed, to be right, to stand apart. But perhaps wisdom lies in knowing when to lead and when to stay connected. For the men watching this, especially those navigating leadership in their families, careers, or communities, California's dilemma mirrors our own daily struggles. The desire to stand strong versus the need to stay united. 9. Texas. Let's talk about Texas, the Lone Star State, a place where independence isn't just history, it's a mindset. You see, Texas was once a republic on its own from the year 1836 to 1845, and it never really let go of that fierce spirit. These days, the idea of Texit, Texas exiting the United States, has started gaining real attention again. Some lawmakers have even pushed for a referendum, asking Texans directly if they should strike out on their own. And it's not just talk. Texas has muscle. With a gross domestic product expected to hit $2.5 trillion in 2025, it stands as a global economic force. The state leads the entire country in oil and natural gas production, and many believe this energy wealth gives Texas the foundation it needs to stand independently. But here's where things get more complex, and where your perspective really matters. While the economic argument for independence is compelling, the political fire is just as strong. Many Texans feel increasingly disconnected from federal policies on gun rights, immigration, and land management. A recent survey from the University of Texas found that 35% of residents support independence. That's more than 1 in 3 people. But friend, here's the catch. There's always a catch. Texas receives billions in federal aid each year, especially for disaster recovery and healthcare. And then there's the military. The infrastructure and national defense support tied to the U.S. Armed Forces is something that can't be easily replaced. So, while slogans like "Don't mess with Texas" are being reborn as cries of "Texas first," we have to ask ourselves, where does pride end and practicality begin? Texas represents more than a political debate. It mirrors our personal questions about identity, freedom, and belonging. Many of us face that same dilemma in our lives. When do we stand alone? When do we lean on others? Whether it's in a relationship, a job, or a life decision, we often wonder if going solo is the answer, or if we're just reacting to discomfort. And maybe that's the lesson here. That while independence may look like strength, sometimes strength is in choosing connection, in choosing to fix what's broken instead of walking away from it. The story of Texas invites us to explore our own boundaries and beliefs, to ask whether freedom is about leaving or about leading. So, as we move forward on this journey through the 10 states that might choose a different path, keep this in mind. Sometimes the boldest act of independence is choosing unity with wisdom. 8. Hawaii. Let's talk about Hawaii, not just as the tropical paradise many of us dream about, but as a place with a deeper, more complex story. When you think of Hawaii, you might picture beaches, sunsets, and warm ocean air, but behind that beauty is a long-standing conversation about independence that's gaining momentum, especially among younger generations. You see, Hawaii was annexed by the United States in the year 1898, under circumstances that many native Hawaiians and historians still see as controversial and unjust. Since then, there has been a quiet but persistent movement, the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, that seeks to reclaim indigenous governance and revive the island's original identity. This isn't just about politics. It's about culture, about memory, and about restoring dignity to a people whose kingdom was taken away. And here's the thing. Because Hawaii is located over 2,000 miles away from the US mainland, the sense of separation isn't just emotional or political, it's geographical. That physical distance makes the idea of independence feel not only symbolic, but in some ways logistically possible. Hawaii's economy is unique, supported by tourism, agriculture, and military contracts. And while those bring in large revenues, they also make the islands heavily dependent on outside forces, especially the mainland. A recent survey from the University of Hawaii found that 28% of residents support some form of self-governance, whether that's full independence or simply more local control. That's more than just a fringe group, it's a sign that many are questioning what the future should look like for Hawaii. The Buddha once said, "You yourself must strive. The Buddhas only show the way." That wisdom is so fitting here. Hawaii's path to sovereignty, if it ever happens, won't be handed to them. It would require vision, unity, and deep resilience. And even then, it won't be easy. There are legal obstacles, economic risks, and geopolitical realities, especially considering how strategic Hawaii is for US military presence in the Pacific. But beneath all that is something powerful, a cultural revival. The Hawaiian language is being taught again, traditional practices are being honored, and pride in native Hawaiian identity is rising. And that cultural pride, that deep connection to something ancient and sacred, may be the strongest force behind this movement. Personally, I think Hawaii's story isn't just about separation, it's about healing. It's about how a place with deep wounds from history is finding its voice again. And maybe, in a world where so many feel lost in noise and division, that's a lesson worth paying attention to. Whether Hawaii ever becomes independent or not, its journey reminds us that reclaiming identity and dignity is a powerful act, not just for a state, but for each of us trying to find where we belong. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment below and tell us, should Hawaii have more self-governance or stay the same? Just type more self-rule or keep it united. It's that simple. 7. Alaska. Alaska, known to many as the last frontier, and it's not just a poetic nickname. Alaska has always stood apart, not only in geography, but in mindset, culture, and its relationship with the rest of the United States. It's a place where mountains rise like walls of silence, and winters stretch for months, where self-reliance isn't a lifestyle trend, it's a necessity. That's why for some Alaskans, the idea of breaking away from the United States is not as far-fetched as it might seem. Since its founding in 1984, the Alaska Independence Party has pushed, often quietly, for a referendum that would allow the people to decide whether to remain part of the Union or become their own nation. While often dismissed as a fringe movement, this desire for sovereignty has recently resurfaced with a fresh sense of relevance. And if you take a closer look, there's more logic behind it than most might expect. Alaska is rich in natural resources, vast reserves of oil, thriving fisheries, and largely untapped minerals. In 2025, the state's gross domestic product passed $80 billion, with the majority coming from resource extraction. That's real money, backed by real assets. But the case for independence isn't just economic, it's deeply psychological. Anchorage, Alaska's largest city, is physically closer to Tokyo than to Washington, D.C. And that distance creates a sense of disconnect from federal decision-making. Many Alaskans feel that national policies, especially around environmental regulations, don't account for the realities of life in the Arctic, and often hurt the industries that sustain their communities. But as we know, every bold dream must face cold truth. Alaska's harsh winters and isolated terrain present serious challenges to self-sufficiency. Its population is small, fewer than 1 million people, and without strong infrastructure and federal funding, everyday essentials like roads, airports, healthcare, and military protection would become much harder to sustain. One of the biggest supports currently in place is the Alaska Permanent Fund, which distributes annual dividends to residents from state oil revenues. Critics of secession argue that without federal oversight and backing, maintaining such systems long-term would be tough, especially as energy markets fluctuate. Additionally, the U.S. military presence in Alaska is not just about defense. It's part of a broader geopolitical strategy in the Arctic and Pacific regions, and that presence brings with it vital investment and jobs. So where does this leave us? In a state like Alaska, where independence feels like part of the air people breathe, the desire to chart a different course is deeply embedded in the culture. But desire alone isn't enough to build a nation. It takes unity, vision, and resilience. There's a Buddhist teaching that goes, "Do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future, concentrate the mind on the present moment." And this rings especially true here, because while Alaska may carry the legacy of rugged independence, the decision to separate from a nation is not about nostalgia or fantasy. It's about weighing the real cost and benefit of such a move in the world we live in now. For you, the listener, may be a man navigating the demands of work, family, or a changing world. Alaska's story can be a reflection of your own. That's the deeper message behind Alaska's push for sovereignty. It's not just about maps or borders. It's about identity, self-reliance, and knowing when to fight for space and when to grow within shared ground. As we explore the remaining states on this list, let Alaska remind us that the greatest frontiers are not always out there. Sometimes they're within. 6. Vermont. For many who live there, Vermont is more than just a place. It's a mindset, and that mindset has sparked real conversations about independence. You might be surprised to learn that from the year 1777 to 1791, Vermont was actually an independent republic before it joined the United States. That legacy still echoes today, especially in the Vermont Republic movement, which argues that the federal government has grown too large, too distant, and too unresponsive to the unique needs of states like theirs. Now, you might ask, could a small state like Vermont ever stand on its own? It's a fair question. Vermont's economy, as of 2025, stands at $37 billion US, modest compared to larger states, and it relies heavily on small-scale agriculture and tourism. But there's power in that simplicity. Vermont is known for its craft beer, its organic farms, and its strong sense of community. Supporters of independence believe that this community-focused culture could form the foundation of a self-sustaining nation, one that lives closer to the land and takes care of its people differently than the current federal system does. Politically, Vermont leans progressive. Its views on healthcare, environmental protection, and military spending often clash with federal priorities, and that tension fuels the conversation about secession. A recent Castleton University poll in 2024 showed that 21% of Vermonters support some form of independence. That's not a majority, but it's enough to keep the discussion alive, not just in newspapers or politics, but in cafes, town halls, and community meetings. Still, breaking away would not be easy. Vermont depends heavily on federal funding for healthcare, public services, and infrastructure. Geographically, it's surrounded by other US states, which would make independent trade, travel, and security very complex. But let's pause here and ask, is independence always about control, or is it about being heard? What if the real struggle is not about separation, but about reconnection to values, to community, and to a way of life that feels authentic? That leads me to a Buddhist story about a monk who asked the Buddha, "Master, how can I free myself?" The Buddha replied, "You are already free. You only need to stop clinging." Sometimes, what we're really seeking is not a new place, but a new way of being in the same place. That's what Vermont's story offers us, a reflection of our own inner tension between staying where we are and stepping into something new. For those of you listening, especially men navigating responsibility, identity, and change. Vermon's journey speaks to that quiet voice inside that sometimes wonders if there's a better way, a way where we feel more in control, more connected, more true to our values. The real lesson here is that independence starts within. It's not just a political act, but a personal one. Whether you're running a business, raising a family, or just trying to live with more purpose, Vermont's quiet defiance reminds us that it's okay to ask hard questions as long as we're ready to listen to the answers. So, as we continue exploring which states might choose to leave the Union, let's not just look at borders or numbers, let's listen to the heart of each place. And maybe in doing so, reconnect with the heart of our own lives. Five, Florida. Next, let's take a closer look at Florida, the Sunshine State, a place many of us associate with beaches, palm trees, and retirement dreams. But beneath that sunny surface, there's a deeper, more complex story unfolding. With a booming economy that reached over $1,600 billion in 2025 and a tourism industry that ranks among the strongest in the world, some people have begun to wonder, could Florida actually stand on its own? It's a bold idea, and while it may sound unlikely at first, it's not without merit. Florida's population has exploded in recent years, bringing with it a growing tension between long-time residents and newcomers from northern states. Many of the older residents are frustrated with federal policies on taxes and immigration, while new arrivals often lean toward maintaining national unity. A recent survey from Florida Atlantic University found that 26% of respondents supported the idea of independence, a significant number, and one that tells us this isn't just a passing thought. Florida's geography plays into this conversation too. Its long coastline and major ports make it a strategic trade hub, especially for commerce with the Caribbean and Latin America. Add to that a well-developed state infrastructure and governance system, and you start to see why some believe the state could, in theory, go it alone. But like any serious decision, there are real risks to consider. Florida is one of the most hurricane-prone areas in the country, and every year it relies heavily on federal disaster relief funds to recover from storms. And then there's the state's large retired population, many of whom depend on Social Security and Medicare, two federal programs that would be jeopardized in a scenario where Florida separated from the United States. So we have to ask ourselves, what does independence really mean, and who benefits or suffers if it happens? Is self-rule about freedom, or is it about security? The Buddha once said, to understand everything is to forgive everything. That reminds us that before we rush to make judgments or take sides, we have to really listen to the fears, hopes, and needs of everyone involved. From my perspective, Florida's case isn't just about politics or economics. It's about identity. It's about a state asking who it really is and whether the system it's part of still reflects its values. And maybe that's something you've felt in your own life too, whether at work, in your relationships, or in your community. Florida's debate reflects a national tension between tradition and transformation, unity and independence, and it invites us to think deeper about how we define belonging. Yes, Florida could, in theory, chart its own path. 4. Oregon. Oregon, with a population of just over 4 million people in the year 2023, Oregon is often seen as one of the most liberal-leaning states in America. And it's no surprise that the idea of independence or increased self-governance has occasionally surfaced in political and public discourse. The state's economic foundation is strong, with a gross domestic product of around $261 billion in 2023, driven largely by real estate, manufacturing, and healthcare. But even with that prosperity, Oregon is facing a growing problem: income inequality. In 2024, reports revealed that 30% of households in cities like Portland were spending over 30% of their income just on housing costs, whether that's rent or mortgages. A burden that's becoming too heavy for many working families. Politically, Oregon leans left, with the Democratic Party holding key positions including governor, secretary of state, and attorney general. This reflects the general views of urban voters, but the divide within the state itself is getting deeper. Rural eastern Oregon often clashes with urban centers over issues like environmental regulations, gun rights, and economic policy. And some of those rural voices have even pushed for joining neighboring Idaho in a controversial proposal called the Greater Idaho Movement. Meanwhile, rising property crime rates in places like Portland are putting additional strain on the public's sense of safety and stability. When values collide, when expectations aren't met, we start to feel that pull between walking away and working it out. There's a Buddhist proverb that says, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." And perhaps the lesson Oregon is trying to teach us isn't about secession or division, but about the hard work of listening, truly listening, to each other, even when the noise of disagreement is loud. From my perspective, what Oregon is experiencing is a tension between who they've become and who they're expected to be. On one hand, they represent progress, green innovation, and a community-driven spirit. On the other, they're dealing with economic disparity, political polarization, and rising frustration in the streets. It's easy to talk about independence when we feel cornered, but maybe the real strength lies in choosing to rebuild trust where it's been broken. Oregon's story reminds us that leadership, whether in a state or within ourselves, isn't about always having the answers. It's about having the courage to ask the right questions, to face discomfort, and to work toward solutions that serve not just the loudest voices, but the most vulnerable ones too. And that's the real wisdom here, that the path forward isn't in breaking away, but in standing firm, rooted like the very forests Oregon is known for, and growing stronger through the storms we weather together. 3. New Hampshire. New Hampshire, a state small in size but mighty in spirit, proudly living by its bold motto, "Live free or die." That's not just a slogan on a license plate. It's a reflection of a deep-rooted belief in individual liberty and minimal government interference, values that have shaped the identity of its people for generations. Groups like the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance have, time and again, pushed for discussions around secession, claiming that the federal government has become too powerful and too disconnected from the everyday lives of citizens. And when you look at the numbers, you start to see why some believe the state could go its own way. By the year 2025, New Hampshire's economy had reached $96 billion, built largely on a strong manufacturing base, low unemployment, and a reputation for business-friendly policies. Supporters of independence argue that, given its relatively self-reliant economy and its location near the Canadian border, New Hampshire might have what it takes to operate independently. What really fuels this movement, though, is cultural identity. Many New Hampshireites take pride in self-reliance, local control, and a skepticism of centralized power. They often feel that Washington, D.C. no longer represents their values or priorities. A survey conducted in 2024 by the University of New Hampshire showed that 29% of respondents supported exploring the possibility of independence, a sign that the conversation is far from over. Still, stepping away from the Union isn't as easy as flipping a switch. For all its strengths, New Hampshire does rely heavily on federal support in areas like healthcare, public education, and infrastructure. Its relatively small population raises real questions about whether it could sustain long-term independence in a rapidly globalizing world. And yet, the desire for freedom continues to echo through town halls and kitchen tables alike. In a Buddhist story, a young monk once asked the Buddha, "What is the greatest freedom?" The Buddha replied, "The freedom from ignorance, fear, and selfish desire." That wisdom reminds us that true freedom isn't just about cutting ties, it's about awakening to what really matters, both as individuals and as a society. And that brings us back to New Hampshire. Maybe the secession debate isn't just about politics or economics. Maybe it's about asking the deeper question. Are we building systems that reflect who we are and who we want to become? For the men listening to this, many of you juggling family, responsibility, and your own search for meaning, New Hampshire's story might sound familiar. It's the same pull you feel when you wonder whether the life you've built still fits, or whether it's time to make a change. But just like in life, the answer may not lie in starting over, but in refining what already exists. The lesson here is that independence begins not with separation, but with clarity, knowing what you stand for and why. Whether or not New Hampshire ever truly walks away from the United States, its unwavering spirit of liberty continues to challenge us to reflect on our own relationship with freedom. And maybe, just maybe, that reflection is where real change begins. Let's keep the conversation going. Drop a quick comment below. Should New Hampshire push for more independence? Just type "more freedom" if you support it, or "stay united" if you don't. Two, Colorado. Known for its stunning mountains, outdoor adventure culture, and a booming tech industry, Colorado surpassed a gross domestic product of $460 billion in 2025, proving that it's not just beautiful, it's economically powerful. But beneath that surface of growth and prosperity, there's an emotional undercurrent that's easy to miss unless you're paying close attention. Many rural communities, especially in the northern part of the state, have begun to express real frustration with what they see as domination by urban areas like Denver and Boulder, cities whose political leanings and economic priorities often don't align with the needs of small towns and farming regions. In fact, back in 2024, Several counties even floated the idea of forming a new state called North Colorado, arguing that state and federal policies no longer represent their values or serve their communities effectively. This isn't just political noise, it's rooted in economic confidence too. With legal cannabis generating billions in annual revenue, a booming tourism industry, and growing investments in renewable energy, many believe Colorado has what it takes to be self-sustaining. And yet, like many other states considering the what-if of independence, it would face real obstacles if it ever decided to break away. The loss of federal funding for infrastructure, support for national parks, and the economic and security presence of military bases would be a major challenge. Public opinion reflects this uncertainty. A 2025 poll shows that only 24% of Colorado residents currently support the idea of independence, a number too small to spark real movement, but large enough to keep the conversation going. The Buddha once said, "It is better to conquer yourself than to win 1,000 battles. Then the victory is yours. It cannot be taken from you." Maybe this applies here. Maybe the real battle isn't between state and country, but between our desire for autonomy and our need for connection. From my perspective, Colorado's story isn't so much about wanting to leave as it is about wanting to be seen, to be heard, and that's something many of us can relate to. Whether you're working a job that doesn't reflect your values, living in a place that feels out of sync with who you are, or just trying to make your voice count, the emotional push behind Colorado's rural-urban divide might feel familiar. Sometimes we think the solution is to walk away, but often the harder and more meaningful path is to stay and work to bridge the gap. Colorado reminds us that independence doesn't always mean leaving. Sometimes it means standing your ground, clearly, firmly, and with purpose, until the conversation shifts and change begins. And that might be the greatest freedom of all, not in separation, but in the strength to shape the place you call home. 1. New York. New York, famously known as the Empire State, might seem like one of the least likely candidates to consider breaking away from the United States. And yet, in recent years, the idea has quietly gained traction, revealing just how complex the relationship between state identity and national unity can be. With a staggering gross domestic product of over $2.1 trillion in 2025, and a global reputation anchored by Wall Street and international tourism, New York holds undeniable economic power. But beneath that prosperity lies a widening rift, not between the state and the nation, but within New York itself. Many of the conversations around secession aren't about the state leaving the country entirely, but rather about whether New York City should separate from its upstate counterparts. For decades, rural communities in the North have felt overshadowed, claiming that the city's political clout, massive tax base, and influence over state policy have left them underrepresented and underserved. In fact, a Siena College survey conducted in 2025 revealed that 30% of upstate residents supported the idea of exploring a split, not because they disliked New York City, but because they believe their voices have been lost in the noise of a global metropolis. It's easy to see why this debate resonates. On one side, New York City stands as a powerhouse, a symbol of finance, diversity, and fast-paced progress. On the other, the upstate regions, rich in natural beauty, agriculture, and traditional values, are seeking a more localized, self-governing approach that reflects their daily reality. The economic argument is compelling on both ends. The city could likely thrive independently, maintaining its status as a financial hub and tourist magnet, while the northern counties believe they could better manage their tax revenues and tailor policies to fit their communities. But, as with any major change, the obstacles are real. Legal complexities, federal aid questions and trade agreements would become tangled knots, requiring decades of negotiation. And beyond the paperwork, there's the human element, the cultural divide between the fast, cosmopolitan pulse of Manhattan and the quieter, more conservative rhythm of upstate life. As America becomes increasingly divided politically and culturally, the friction within states like New York raises questions about the deeper meaning of unity. And here's a moment for reflection. When systems feel too big, too distant, and too disconnected from your values, what does real representation look like? The Buddha once said, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." So if people begin to think that their identity, needs, and beliefs are no longer reflected in the structure they're a part of, it's no surprise they begin to imagine something new, something closer to home. From my perspective, New York's internal debate is less about rebellion and more about recognition. The longing of smaller communities to be seen and heard amid the roar of the city. And maybe that's something many of us relate to, not just politically, but personally. New York's dilemma is a mirror of our modern world. Fast-paced growth on one side, a longing for rooted simplicity on the other. And the lesson it leaves us with is this: true strength in any system, whether it's a country, a community, or even a family, comes not from uniformity, but from a willingness to understand differences and create space for all voices. Thank you for spending your time with the Journey of Wisdom. If you found value in today's insights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss what's coming next. See you in the next video, where wisdom meets real life.